When we talk about wars in AP American history class, there's a real strong emphasis on cultural or social history. So we're going to look extensively about how wars affected minorities, how it affected women, and needless to say, there's a lot of similarities between World War I and World War II. Um, Below this voice thread on the webpage, I haven't done it yet, so I'm just envisioning what it's going to look like. There's going to be another voice thread. The second voice thread is one that I made a long time ago. It was when I was first learning how to do voice thread. I was taking this voice thread class, and it was a voice thread that I made as a student of the voice thread class. I wanted to let you know that because when you watch it, I'm actually doing it for a class, not for my students. But I wanted to post it because it is a really powerful cartoon of Bugs Bunny and a very racist cartoon, and it has a lot to do with this double B campaign. So when you're done watching this voice thread, I'm going to ask you to watch the other voice thread. The other voice thread is really 5, 6 minutes. You don't have to do anything, but please watch it. I think you'll find it particularly interesting. I mean, it's Bugs Bunny. That might be a draw or an interest of you, but it's a particularly powerful little cartoon that has to do with what I'm talking about now. Well, when we talk about African Americans in World War I talked about the Great Migration and how hundreds of thousands of African Americans following World War I migrate to the Northeast, and in many ways, they have a lot of characteristics of immigrants. They live in neighborhoods, they migrate to northeastern cities, Philadelphia, New York, etc. World War II had an important effect on African Americans as well. Shortly after World War II, the military is desegregated. Which is needless to say important. But we see this double V campaign. The double V campaign stands for victory in Europe. So we're going to beat Hitler in Europe, but also victory at home against racism. And African Americans are serving in huge numbers. They're serving in segregated units. Uh, and, the hypocrisy of fighting against the totalitarian government that denies people their individual rights as you're living in a segregated America was just, so clear during World War II to many African Americans that as they're fighting for freedom in Europe, they also were committed to gaining their freedom at home. A lot of people think of the civil rights movement happening in the 60s, but really some of the most important moments of the civil rights movement happened in the 50s following World War II. We had Jackie Robinson, we had Rosa Parks, all those events happened in the 1950s. So it's notable and certainly influenced by World War II. We talked about the NAACP already. CORE stands for Congress of Racial Equality, and another civil rights group that emerged following World War II. Once again, please watch that Bugs Bunny voice thread that should be just below this voice thread on the webpage. I think you'll find it interesting. Well, here's a group that we didn't really talk about World War I, Mexican Americans. During World War II, labor was a real problem. We talked about Rose of the River, or certainly you've talked about Rose of the River in the past, and Americans needed a labor source. So the borders were opened up to this group that became called the Braceros. I might be butchering that pronunciation, but these were Mexican immigrants who were allowed to immigrate to America. Immigration reform was instituted to make it easier for them to immigrate into America so that they could work. We needed workers. Many of these Mexican American immigrants were discriminated against, and maybe the best example of this is something called the Zoot Suit Riot. I know I have a lot of students who are in chorus or jazz or band, and there's a very famous jazz song entitled Zoot Suit Riot, and I don't know if you knew the history behind it as you were playing it in jazz band, but I tried to find a good picture of a zoot suit. This is a zoot suit. And a zoot suit, as you can see, has a lot of fabric to it. The jacket would come all the way down to the knees. It would be double-breasted, so if you were to fold this over, it would go all the way over here, and the other side would go all the way over there. The pants come way up here. And there's a lot of fabric to it. And in and of itself, it's a pretty stylish look, but during World War II, with all of these shortages that we talked about, cloth being one of them, it was seen as really unpatriotic. So these braceros who are wearing these zoot suits had a couple things going against them. There's discrimination against them because they're Mexican American, and they're also wearing these zoot suits that were offensive to a lot of Americans. This is an actual picture that was taken at the Zoot Suit riot, and you can see these soldiers just walking around with these billy clubs. They were beating up these Mexican Americans, and that's the Zoot Suit riot. Now, when we talk about World War I, we didn't really talk a whole lot about Mexican Americans during World War I, and certainly didn't play as an important role in World War I. So that might be a contrast that you could talk about. Another bit of social history involving World War II is Native Americans. Lots of Native Americans fought in World War II, and really a very important consequence of Native Americans and World War II is that they left the reservation to go fight in World War II, and many never returned to the reservations. This was one of the most destructive things to Native American culture, possibly since the Dawes Act. And when you look at Native American history, especially in American history, there's a number of important events. Needless to say, we think of initial interaction, the Columbia Exchange, followed by the Trail of Tears would be another hallmark event, the Dawes Act, and then really very comparably is World War II. Not in a negative way, needless to say, but Native Americans who were living on the reservation and joined the Army or the Navy or the Air Force, Marines, or regardless, joined the military, and they kind of got a taste for what life off the reservation was like, and they never came back. One of the most destructive things to Native American culture was World War II, interestingly enough. Well, when you talk about comparing World War I and World War II, one of the most obvious connections is the idea that during times of war, you are more likely to lose your civil rights. During World War I, we talked about the Schenck case and the restriction of free speech during war, uh, establishing the idea of a clear and present danger. And during times of war, your speech can be restricted. During times of war, during World War II, we talked about the equally important court case, Korematsu versus the United States. This is Korematsu, and I always find it interesting to talk about Korematsu because obviously he has a Japanese last name, but his first name is Fred. He was a Japanese American, but he was very American. The idea of him being some type of Japanese spy was ridiculous. FDR issues Executive Order 9066, and thousands of Japanese Americans were sent to internment camps. Um, the idea was that, especially on the west coast of the United States, these Japanese Americans could be a risk, that they could be involved in some type of insurgency, that they could be involved in some type of terrorism, some type of spying, and Japanese Americans were sent to camps, essentially denied their Fifth Amendment right, and locked up. Fred Korematsu sued, saying that he's being detained without a trial, without just cause, and that he shouldn't be locked up. The Supreme Court ruled that during times of war, people can be denied these rights if there's just cause, and in this case, there was just cause, said the Supreme Court. Really a remarkable ruling. Needless to say, it was influenced by racial discrimination. For example, German Americans weren't locked up, Italian Americans weren't locked up, and really one of the saddest chapters in American history. A full 40 plus years later, the American Congress will issue reparations to Japanese Americans, a real nominal fee. I have to apologize. I forget the exact number, but it wasn't a lot of money was given to the survivors of these internment camps. But more importantly, The Supreme Court has never reversed Korematsu versus the United States, which means that it is currently the law of the United States that this would happen. Kind of uh, bringing to light just how unjust this was, there was a very famous combat team during World War II, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up entirely of Japanese Americans. And this group won more medals. It's the most highly decorated group of all of World War II. And the idea that as they are risking and sacrificing their lives the way no other unit did in World War II, that their family at home were being detained in internment camps is a particularly touching part of this story. Of course, when we talk about World War II, we talk about women. And boy, you could have a real interesting debate whether World War I or World War II had a bigger influence on women. Uh, Rosie the Riveter is kind of, no pun intended, the poster child for women and war. And I feel like this is a cliche that we know well, but women really, were incredibly responsible for winning the war, especially in a modern war where military production is such a big part of whether or not you can win. Women in the factories, riveting those planes together, making those ships, making those tanks, making those uniforms played a huge part in the war. If you're just looking for a little escapism, and I don't think you need to study American history 24/7, but if you ever watch the movie League of Their Own, that's a great movie that illustrates this. And I mean, the baseball field isn't the same thing as an airplane factory, but the sentiment is there, and certainly some important principles are there of what women did and how women were viewed when they come back. It's interesting that this generation of women, these women were the daughters of the flappers, and their daughters are going to be the daughters that in many ways break through that glass ceiling and become the first women to be in the Supreme Court and in the Senate and as CEOs. So it's kind of interesting to look at the transition in that way. Well, when you talk about World War I, you're going to talk about things like the advent of tanks and barbed wire and hand grenades and machine guns, and what an important effect that had on World War I. Needless to say, uh, the development of the atomic bomb in World War II was an equally, if not more important technological development uh, in the 20th century. The Manhattan Project, kids sometimes don't know why it's called Manhattan Project, and us living so close to New York City, it's because most of the scientists who worked on it were from Columbia University, which of course is in Manhattan. Robert Oppenheimer, just a real genius, very young to be leading such an important group. He was an absolute genius. As a young child, I'll never forget reading the story. He was like 11 or 12, and he told his